thank you, colleagues, for joining us for today's discussion on what I think is a very important topic of recognizing and rewarding high impact research. This webinar is going to be really a sneak preview, I would say, of work that has been undertaken jointly with American Educational Research Association, and that was funded by NSF, by the Mellon Foundation, and by NEH. The full report will be out later this spring, and I'm looking forward to working with my co-PI, Felice Levine, who could not be here with us today, but most assuredly will be in our subsequent work to not only broaden the conversation, but work with our stakeholders and colleagues to move, I'll just say, from thinking to action over the coming months. To put this webinar in context, I want to point out the vantage points from which I come to this work. First, I do so from CGS's now almost decade-long work with its members to facilitate better preparation of graduate students for the work of the future, careers that almost certainly will involve multiple jobs across different employment sectors. And second, as we await the Supreme Court's decision on the 2 graduate admission cases now before it, I come to this conversation with a perhaps even more urgent reason, and that is the need to fully embrace and realize a genuinely inclusive graduate ecosystem. So to the first point, as we have encouraged students to produce work in formats consistent with their career aspirations and of interest to diverse stakeholders, we've made some real progress, I would say. And yet at the same time, we've made progress in setting up programming and internships and other kinds of opportunities. I've come to realize that we still talk in a very restricted way about the kind of work that we value. And this is true, even though our PhD career pathways study work very clearly shows that the intellectual skills used in business, government, nonprofits, and the academy are far more similar than they are different. But when I talk with my colleagues about how do you recognize high quality work, we do so in ways that are almost entirely in terms of conventional, traditional scholarly metrics. The number of awards our faculty earn, the number of grant dollars they procure, the number of papers and monographs they produce that appear in selective journals and prestigious university presses. But we largely lack a vocabulary for describing the kind of scholarship that results from contributions to the process of research or to products that do not result in traditional scientific scholarly products. And you can imagine it is rather hard to convince our students that their work matters and that we value it when we lack words to recognize or talk about it. So, of course, this concern is not new. I would say challenges to the limits of traditional ranking and recognition and reward systems are probably at least 3 decades old, driven, I think, in part by 5 interrelated trends: the rise of big data, digitization and the impact of living in a 5G world, utilization of accountability systems that were intended to enable more careful stewardship of public and private funds. This is all compounded by decreasing trust in institutions, including higher education and science, and then the hyper-competitiveness for funding that characterizes so much of the research enterprise. But finally, and to my earlier point, most importantly, the second vantage point and trend grows out of essentially, I would describe it as the omnipresence of racial violence and exclusion. Why is it that despite what I think are good faith and earnest efforts to create a more diverse and inclusive graduate program, is it so hard to unwind the processes that underlie it? Holistic admissions alone would almost certainly have to be in place for decades to begin undoing past harms. And with its current configuration, the Supreme Court is quite likely to make even this tool harder to use. So I want to suggest that inequality and exclusion are really built into the very fabric of what we call high quality research and scholarship. If you all haven't read the book Misconceiving Merit, do so. It is one of the most compelling, troubling books I've read in a very long time. Authors Mary Blair Loy and Aaron Check demonstrate that the science that women and those from racially and ethnically underrepresented groups are discounted, partly because they are interested in problems and communities that do not fit within disciplinary journals or traditions, partly because of biases in the peer review process. And in one really compelling study, it was documented that underrepresented students, and this is in quotations, innovate at higher rates than majority students, but their novel contributions are discounted and less likely to earn them academic positions or recognition. From my point of view, to be high quality research, high quality graduate programs, we simply have to embrace new voices, new questions, and new paradigms. Indeed, we really should insist that this is what inclusion means in its fullest sense, and that without it, our scholarship and our work is diminished. I believe that there's never been a better time to embrace the challenge of rethinking scholarly reward and incentive systems. And so I'm really pleased to have our four panelists with us today. Several were with us last spring at this CGS AERA convening. Each has taken concrete steps to move us in a direction of a more capacious view of high quality, high impact work. Each has approached the challenge from a slightly different point in the ecosystem. Lauren Whitehead will describe his work building a consortium of universities working jointly to advance high bar research, and he'll tell you more about high bar research. Janet Rutledge will describe the work that she and her colleagues at UMBC have undertaken in response to their university's designation as a community engaged university, and how that has begun to translate into changes in the tenure and promotion system. Michael Doherty will describe the work he has undertaken, this time at the department level and in his role as department chair, again, to widen the understanding of what constitutes research excellence and to provide mentoring and support of it. And Jim Grossman from the American Historical Association will talk about what he describes as sideways in work. And that is, how does the Disciplinary Association supplement and complement both top-down and bottom-up models of change? Each of our panelists, and in the order I've introduced them, will spend 7 to 8 minutes describing the work they are doing. I will let them introduce one another in turn. And as they conclude, I will queue up 2 or so questions to which they will respond. We want to leave plenty of time for conversation and questions. And again, as Sarah said, please put those questions in the Q&A and we will try to entertain them as we get to them. And so, without further ado, Lauren, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Very good. Well, thank you, Suzanne. And I have to say, I really appreciated your opening remarks, which were sobering, but also very inspiring. So it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I have been asked to provide some introductory remarks about overall organizational improvement as a general idea, as well as some related thoughts about the roles of graduate students in academic research. So I'll start on that more general level. Over the years, I've held various administrative positions or leadership positions, both in industry and also in academia. And so naturally, I've often felt the need to consult with experts on organizational change, of which there are many. Unfortunately, as you likely all know, most organizational change efforts fail, sadly. In order to succeed, though, the good news is experts generally agree that there are 3 requirements which are seldom met. If they are met, efforts often do succeed. So this isn't really a complete black box. And my version of these 3 requirements, I think they're quite general, is basically with regard to a change effort, bluntly, don't even start without strong evidence that the proposed change is essential. Assuming you have that evidence, the next requirement is that in order to achieve change, you'll need key allies who must collaborate together effectively for a very long time. I think I could say a disturbingly long time. It's very easy to underestimate that required time. And then equally importantly, the third point is that the resultant new, so-called new normal must then be seen correctly as being significantly better than the way things were. And if you think back 20 years, you can certainly think of many, many things that we would never want to return to. But at the time when those changes occurred, they weren't easy. So anyways, the really good news is that if you do those things, not only is there a good chance that you'll succeed, but the beautiful thing is that new normal, once embraced and understood, is pretty much self-perpetuating. So that's the payback. The bad news is very hard to do. The good news is with success, actually things can go on and continue very nicely. So that's why it's such a pleasure today to participate in this workshop. And in so doing, I'd like to reflect on an idea that was introduced originally in about 2010 by the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching and Learning. It's a very simple idea. They introduced, for the first time, I think, in the academic world, a concept they called networked improvement communities, which was having great impact at the time. I don't know if you'll recall this, but at the time, there was a lot of work underway in improving safety in medical operating procedures, in particular in operating rooms. Huge improvements were made in the success rate of surgery without error. And so I guess you could say we're moving on to apply that idea in a kind of a different form of brain surgery, how we influence our students, hopefully without harm. So inspired by the work at Carnegie, I had the good fortune at about that time of working with colleagues in several universities to launch an organization that was called the Bayview Alliance, in which academic experts from 12 governing universities, along with many others, collaborated to improve STEM university education. In 2018, we had the good fortune of launching an analogous effort at the graduate level, which is called the High Bar Research Alliance. And it was launched to consider a different challenge related to the research enterprise. And we think it's one, as Suzanne mentioned, that's very relevant to students and general discussion today. So the common element that you'll see in all of this discussion, and which I'm sure will come up today, is to gather people together in a relaxed but informal, organized manner. Just the right amount of organization in order to tackle common problems. And generally, the format of these gatherings is a large number of small meetings with comprising experts from multiple organizations who have shared interests and who enjoy collaborating with one another. So these are our friendly gathering of colleagues that are purposed in a manner that everybody agrees to and can be very effective and actually very fun. And I'm sure we all have many experiences like that to think of. But the idea of organizing it among a network of universities in just the right way is a challenge, but one that is able to be done, I think, quite well. So on that note, I'd like to talk about the HRA, or High Bar Research Alliance, a little bit more. And Sarah, if you wouldn't mind opening the slide, that would be just great. So briefly, the High Bar Research Alliance, HRA, is a network encouraging academics and non-academics to collaborate on what is called high bar research projects. And well, that name has been around for, I guess, about 6 or 7 years. It's not a new kind of research at all. It's a time-honored form of research. But if you look at the literature, you'll find maybe 10 different names that approximately mean this idea, but not quite. And so after great deliberation, a bunch of experts across the country settled on introducing this word just because at least it's clear. So the definition of this is highly integrative, basic, and responsive work. And the key aspect of the definition is kind of a Venn diagram situation. It means, that name means that a given research project combines two synergistic dualities. Next, please, Sarah. And the first of those two dualities is that of being dually engaged. And specifically, that refers to the idea of academic and non-academic experts together co-leading the research project in question as equals, which means they have shared goals and they work through deeply collaborative decision-making for the duration of the project. So this is deep collaboration. It's not common, but it's also not uncommon, and it's not new. So there have been research projects from time, many, certainly decades, probably from the beginning of research, that had a character very much like is described here. So there's nothing controversial about this, other than perhaps the idea of pointing out that it can be very powerful, and perhaps we should encourage this kind of power. So that's the first of the two dualities. And Sarah, if you put the next one up, please. Thank you. This next one is the duality of being dually purposed. So high bar research projects help society in these two ways. Indirectly, they help society because they strengthen research. This work makes research better. So that's good, very good for society, of course. But also directly, the projects in question are designed to address and solve important societal problems. And again, it's the duality of those two purposes that history has shown to be highly generative. So specifically, those high bar dualities boost diversity of all forms, fairness, enthusiasm, creativity, and wisdom. And I can't claim to know exactly why, but I can tell you I've felt it. And it's a very nice feeling to be on a team like this and have these situations arise. And somehow it just generates, often in good situations, generates a tremendous energy. So in summary, I think we can say that when institutions collaborate on change efforts together, good ideas can emerge and spread very quickly. And on that note, I think, Suzanne, my preference would be pass back to you. Or, oh, pardon me, if it's okay with you, I will pass on to Janet. Janet, would you like to continue?
Thank you very much. And I've learned a new term today, and I think that it really aptly describes a lot of the things that we are endeavoring to do at UMBC. So what a great lead-in. Next slide, please. UMBC has been designated a community engaged university from the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. And this classification really acknowledges all the things that we had been doing up to that point, and it includes faculty, staff, students, and very importantly, our community partners that we work together with. And the important thing about Carnegie's definition of community engagement is that it emphasizes the importance of reciprocity and mutual benefits in the partnerships that are created. So it's not just the university saying, we are brilliant people with PhDs and we're going to tell you people in the community what you need. It's really a back and forth of understanding what the community needs are and working side by side to come up with solutions and implement them. Next slide, please. So we said that we really needed to live our values. So in addition to the community engagement, UMBC has also claimed that we value interdisciplinarity and that diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility were important to us and quite frankly is what UMBC has been known for. And so I want to give you some examples of how we are endeavoring to really live these values that we say we have. So first, from our vision statement, our UMBC community redefines excellence in higher education through an inclusive culture that connects innovative teaching and learning, research across the disciplines, and civic engagement. In our research administration tagline, public research for public good, you see that we're combining all of those things together, and we are claiming to the world and to each other that this is what we do. After we received the Carnegie Community Engagement designation, we said, well, we better put it in our promotion and tenure guidelines. And so you can see that in the statements at each level of assistant, associate, full professor, in the example of what counts as scholarship is community engaged scholarship project outcomes. And more recently, we said, well, if we take DEIA seriously, we also need to put that in our tenure and promotion guidelines. And you can see the statement here that UMBC's abiding commitment to inclusive excellence requires that faculty contributions to diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility receive recognition and reward in the academic review process. And so right now we are in the process of each department revising their promotion and tenure guidelines to incorporate DEIA. A few years ago, they did the same thing for the community engaged scholarship. Next slide, please. So what's really important is, we can say all these things, but people have to believe it. And so here are two quotes from our faculty, and these quotes are very prominently shared in a document about public research for public good that is available externally for anyone to see, but is celebrated internally. And so one of the faculty members in information systems said, UMBC has a uniquely forward-thinking research culture which values community engaged scholarship, inclusive excellence, and interdisciplinary research. To put it simply, UMBC fosters research which has a real and direct impact on people and on our society. A faculty member in public policy said, UMBC has created an infrastructure, and that's important, an infrastructure for conducting socially engaged, actionable, and interdisciplinary research. This is a place in which research that seeks to advance social justice, democracy, and inclusion is incentivized, celebrated, recognized, valued, and supported. It is an exciting place. And I think that these terms are that you're not just saying it, but that you are supporting it, that you are talking about it. And when people do well, it is celebrated and it is recognized, and people know that it is valued. Next slide, please. So how does this get to graduate research and graduate education? I have some examples here that show both the research that our PhD students are doing alongside their faculty who have been doing all of these wonderful things, and also some particular training grant that we developed for master students. So in the first case, this is a PhD student in our human-centered computing program, and he's working with a community center that deals with underserved and marginalized communities. And he's looking at an intersectional framework to investigate accessible services and technology in LGBTQIA+ centers and safe spaces. And so, this is one of those things that hand in hand with the community center, the research is happening, the services are happening, and understanding the full impact on the populations that are being served. In the second instance, we have a grant from the NSF. It's one of the NSF, forgotten the name of the term, the NRT, the NSF training grants. And this, interestingly enough, is focused on master's programs, and it's very interdisciplinary. Students in science, engineering, policy, economics. And this student, I really like what he said. So he's working with a company, a very small company on the Eastern Shore that is cultivating oysters. And he said, I used to think research was very isolated, but in iCare, that's the name of the training grant, you're putting that research into practice. You can create benefit in the community by doing the research and giving people access to that data. And so this is someone who originally, when he came here, said, I don't want to do research. That's not for me. And now he's going on to get his PhD because he has had such a good experience in seeing that you can do public research for public good in an interdisciplinary way. Next slide, please. And this one more example of working with a community center. This is in our applied developmental psychology program. where there are several students who are working with Chinese and Korean children by working with the children and the parents. And, you know, working alongside the people at the community center who are providing services to the families. Next slide, please. Can you move on to the next slide? Okay, so in order to help promote this campus-wide, there are many resources that are made available to students. So we have on campus what's called the Shriver Center that is for service learning and community engagement. And there are all kinds of ways that students can get involved. At the graduate level, we have a program called the Peace Worker Fellows Program that is students who were in the Peace Corps and are returning to graduate school. And they are able to continue their tradition of public service as graduate students. In our language, literacy, and culture PhD program, they started a fellowship to encourage their students to engage in publicly engaged research and storytelling. In our geography and environmental systems, they have developed an actual class that helps students understand how to get engaged with the community. And in our College of Engineering and IT, there's a whole set of community initiatives that students are encouraged to get involved with. Next slide, please. And finally, the DEIA work, as I stated, is a little bit newer than the work that we've been doing in community engagement. But I really love the website that's been put together that says DEIA work is academic excellence. And there are several tabs on the website that include resources for promotion and tenure. As I said, each department is being asked to show how they are incorporating that into their tenure and promotion guidelines for their department. Stories of faculty accomplishments, links to articles, books, podcasts, webinars, and we have several faculty affinity groups on campus. So if someone wants to get involved with, for example, the Black Faculty and Staff Association, or one of the working groups that's looking at community engaged scholarship, and also resources to offices on campus. So that in a nutshell is the work that we are doing. And I will next turn it over to Michael.
Hi, I'm going to go ahead and advance to my slide. That would be great. Thank you. So what I'm going to do is I'll summarize some efforts that we've undertaken here at the University of Maryland College Park in my department. There also have been some other efforts that we've been working on, or I've been working on in collaboration with the Higher Education Leadership Initiative on Open Science, which aligns with this effort as well, and also trying to do some other international or national work, with departments of psychology around the country as well. So actually a few things that came up in the prior two presentations that kind of rung a bell. First, in Lauren's discussion, he talked about the time that's needed to sort of build sort of the momentum to push real change through, right? It takes a lot of work, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And also the need to build, to identify key allies and to cultivate those allies. And then, whatever you get to needs to be better than what comes, what came before it. And I'll just sort of say that the latter part is actually the easy part, because most people realize the incentive system as it is realized within academia is broken. They may not use the word broken, but many people see that there are some serious problems with that, with the incentive system. And I will also take sort of a counterpoint to Lauren's point about it. It's difficult. I say, but it's difficult, but it's not like solving climate change, okay? Climate change is a seriously difficult problem. And in fact, I would argue that revising the way we think about faculty incentives is a relatively easy process. I mean, it's complicated and it's not straightforward. It does take effort and time, but relatively speaking, it's easier than solving climate change. But in order to solve climate change, it does require that we have a system that invites diversity approaches and really broadens the network of scientists who can be on board to solve those hard problems. Okay, so what have we been doing here in my department? Well, first of all, this started in, I want to say, 2017, when I stepped into the chair position. One of the things that I ran on, if you will, when I was nominated or self-nominated to take on the role, was that I wanted to overhaul the way we thought about tenure and promotion. So this is back in 2017. What I realized very quickly in that process is that historical ways of defining success were so ingrained in people's mind that it was really hard for them to think of alternative ways to discuss or even talk about, the incentives that we have in our system. So, what is it that defines excellence? And when you ask that question to people in academia, they kind of default to the key indicators that we've always had. Well, the problem with the key indicators that we've always had is that they impose systemic barriers, right? So we know things like impact factors devalue work that is targeted towards specific communities of interest, right? And that women and underrepresented scholars tend to focus on, or many of them focus on problems that are of interest to smaller communities, but really important to those communities. And so by virtue of relying on impact factors, we sort of inadvertently, either implicitly or explicitly, devalue the work of colleagues who are really tackling difficult community engaged problems. The same problems arise with things like citation counts that we know are very highly biased against women and underrepresented scholars. So when we got into this, I should say, sort of took a full 360 view of our incentive structures, and we decided that we would revise everything from the hiring process on all the way through merit and annual review, promotion and tenure. I developed internal funding mechanisms aimed at funding initiatives that would support community engaged work, and other efforts to sort of broaden participation in academic science and psychology, and also more recently rolled out some faculty awards aimed specifically at rewarding people who are engaged in the types of work that we really felt that we wanted to reward. So our reward systems switched from sort of the traditional academic system to one that really reimagined incentives as reinforcing our institutional values. So as a land grant institution, obviously we're here to serve the public. But if you look at traditional academic incentive systems, the word public will show up in things like service. That tends not to be well represented in research. So when we reimagined our incentive structures, we really interwove these values into basically everything throughout these processes of hiring, annual review, promotion, internal funding, awards, and so forth. The other thing we did was we moved away from proxy indicators to really focusing on the behaviors of the researcher. So many of the things that you will find in our tenure and promotion criteria or annual review criteria really focus on the behaviors of people, not on things like awards or citations or impact factors. In fact, we've expunged citations and impact factors from our indicators, in part because of the fact that they're systematically biased. And then we tried to build consistency across all these different evaluation points. So when people are onboarded and recruited into jobs, they're recruited with the idea that they're going to be rewarded and incentivized to do the type of work that we're hiring them to do, right? We don't want to hire someone who does work in a hard to reach community or population, only to have them get here and tell them, well, we don't actually value that. We really need you to focus on X, Y, and Z. And so what we've tried to do is to really infuse these values throughout all of our incentives so that the basis for their hiring is not just in the hiring ad or when we recruit them, but it shows up on our annual evaluations. It shows up at our promotion tenure process. They have an opportunity to apply for internal funding mechanisms to support those activities. and of course, can be receive some internal awards for their work as well. This has been a multi-year process. So I said I started this in 2017, and it took us until about 2022 to wrap this up and to finally put something into action. One of the things I discovered throughout that process is it really did require a good amount of education. So one of the principles by which I try to live and lead is to use data to inform my decisions. And so what I had to do was then to pull up the data on why what we were doing really was not good. And once I shared that with the faculty, I think were much more open to change. I guess just to sort of wrap this up, we were able to vote in our annual review and promotion tenure processes with unanimous consent from the entire department. So a vote of 27-0. So nobody objected to it, and we're in the process of implementing that now. So we have the first set of faculty going through that process. And I think with that, I am going to turn it over to James. James, you're on.
Yes, okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Suzanne, for organizing this and inviting me. I'm going to try to pull together some of the threads spun in the past hour through a description of the American Historical Association's work in changing graduate education and reward systems in the academy. What perhaps makes the AHA's work unusual is that we center the role of departments and see scholarly associations as capable of driving change. Hence Suzanne's reference to sideways in. It's not bottom up, and it's not top down coming from the administration. In both of the spaces that I'm going to talk about, the main organizing principle is that there are many ways to be a historian. We started this messaging. There are many ways to be a historian. When we embarked on what we initially called our Career Diversity Initiative a decade ago, and we've been pleasantly surprised to see career diversity become the term of art within the academy. People have stopped, fortunately, talking about alt-ac and adopted a term that does not suggest that everybody has to pretend to be an academic or that these other things are alternative, but that there are a wide variety of career paths that PhD recipients can pursue. Our Career Diversity Initiative started as an attempt to broaden the career horizons and opportunities for recent recipients of the PhD in history. I don't need to tell this group why this was imperative, not only on a humane basis, but also in terms of our influence in public culture, our influence in various economic sectors, but also in thinking about graduate admissions. As long as we adhered to a single definition of success, in other words, a tenure track appointment, preferably at an R1, we were, in essence, looking at a pipeline with a very narrow entrance. Because whether it's undergraduate admissions, graduate admissions, or almost anything else where we make these kinds of decisions, we spend our resources where it's most likely to be successful. And if we have a single definition of what a successful PhD recipient is, then we are going to have a very narrow definition of who we should fund, who we should admit, and who we should fund. Once we broaden our definitions of success at the end, we create a much wider aperture at the very beginning. And indeed, the central issue from the beginning, or one of the central issues, involved definitions of success. The importance of us helping students to consider what Suzanne referred to as multiple jobs across different employment sectors, the perfect wording for this. and we've all covered a lot of this already, especially Suzanne. The AHA's work is linked in the chat. I think if we can put up the link to the AHA's Career Diversity Program, we realized quickly that the crucial challenge was cultural change. And I should emphasize that we are not there yet. But there was also structural change, such as university allocation of resources, according to each department's record of placing their students in academic tenure track positions. And by the way, this is another issue of vocabulary. The AHA does not use the word place or any variation of it, placement, anymore. We have dropped that from our vocabulary. Nobody is placed. There is nobody in this room, virtual and otherwise, who is capable of, quote, placing a graduate student in a job. That is language from the past, and we do not use it anymore. It suggests, in essence, a lack of agency on the part of students. As does, by the way, we've also dumped any reference to producing PhDs. We do not use that term, and I strongly encourage everybody in this room to stop using the term. PhDs are earned, not produced. We soon realized, however, that we had to work with our departments to reconsider the curriculum and other aspects of graduate education, rather than simply starting at the end and thinking about how to encourage students to do different things. What that brought us to was a recognition that every history department had to start by thinking about the purpose of their PhD program. And in some ways, we kind of happened upon this by accident. We had a bunch of directors of graduate study around a table one day, and we somehow got onto this, and I said, okay, stop the discussion. Let's go around the table and everybody articulate the purpose of their PhD program. This was 10 years ago, really before our initiative had gotten much steam. Nearly everybody around the table said, and this was virtually an incantation, the purpose of our PhD program is to train the next generation of producers of new knowledge. You've all heard that. Well, the problem was that only about half of our PhDs were going on to professorships, tenure track professorships. And of that half, rough at best, a quarter at the most prestigious institutions, were going to places where their work would be research intensive. In essence, when looking at the actual career paths of our PhD recipients, we realized that most people were not spending most of their time creating new knowledge. They certainly were spending some of their time, no matter what they did, because our PhD recipients love to do research, they're good at it, et cetera, et cetera. But that was not what they were spending most of their time doing. So in essence, we were preparing people for work that was going to be taking up of a minority of their time. And we were not giving them the skills that enabled them to think about a wider variety of careers. So one of the things that we've done actually in our visits to history departments is we've started off by having faculty sitting around a table with faculty, history department faculty, and asking this question. At the beginning, we still got training the next generation of producers of new knowledge. We now get actually a much wider variety of answers. At one institution, they put up on the board 9 possibilities of purposes of their graduate program, of their PhD program. What was unfortunate was the first person to answer the question said, we need TAs. And my ride to the airport after the meeting came from the one graduate student representative sitting in on the meeting. And he had held his tongue diplomatically, but you could imagine once he opened up to me on the way to the airport, how he felt about the first purpose articulated of their PhD program being to have teaching assistants. But we realized it was crucial for departments to think about this. Why are we doing this? Where are these people who are getting our PhDs going? And this really must be discussed at the departmental level, because it's in different disciplines have different types of career paths, and their students have different goals coming in. I hate to say, in one place, 29 faculty members sitting around a table, I asked this question. There was dead silence, which was actually quite common. And one guy sitting 4 people to my left, I can put him exactly at the table, looked up and said, cloning. Dead silence again. And the department chair afterwards said to me, I need to apologize. Actually, it's not, majority of my colleagues don't really believe that. Only a third. So bad enough. So this was, what we realized was that this had to be done through departments. You had to begin with the purpose of the department's PhD program. And my colleague, Emily Swafford, and I visited more than 50 history departments over a period of about 5 years, nearly a third of all history PhD programs, in most cases with a lot of overlap and even multiple visits by each of us. Departments determine curriculum. They are also the site of culture. Some people think this is a bad thing. Only by transcending disciplines can we create change. We disagree. We think that departments bring together people across generations, across geographical fields of interest and methods, but who have enough in common to create communities. And historians, sociologists, and others know that communities are effective generators of change that is not top-down. We also focus on departments and on the role of a scholarly association because we're well aware that any initiative that comes from the administration is met with immediate suspicion by many faculty. If the provost wants us to do this, there must be something wrong. There must be something that's undermining our autonomy or worse. And the higher in the administration, the greater the suspicion. Scholarly associations, on the other hand, do not generate suspicion. We have no power. We can't help people increase their salaries. We can't influence an individual's tenure or promotion. We offer no meaningful rewards other than recognition from peers. This relates to the levers that we do have, the powers to convene, legitimate, and inspire. And that power to legitimate is central to the second arena relevant to today's conversation, which we just heard about. The AHA's new guidelines for broadening the definition of historical scholarship. There's a link to those guidelines going up in the chat, which pertains less directly to the work of graduate students, I realize we're graduate deans here, than to tenure, promotion, and expectations in places where historians work other than higher education. It also relates very closely to graduate education, though, as an aspect of our message to graduate students that there are many ways to be a historian. In most history departments, scholarship has traditionally and primarily encompassed books, journal articles, and book chapters, papers presented at conferences. The weight and significance of these may vary considerably by institution, but the valued coin remains the book, a particular kind of book known only in academia and scholarly publishing as a monograph. Many other categories of books don't count, and we don't have to get into that. Within this frame, and even at its edges, current practices vary. Different institutions have different expectations of quantity and quality, but vary according to their priorities and their other kinds of flexibility. Scholarship that does not frame a narrative in the context of historiography or theoretical and methodological significance is often permissible only as a second book. These narrow channels leave too little room for the great range of work that historians do as scholars. Limiting the diversity of scholarly genres limits the diversity of potential scholars. Historical work that lies outside the traditional frame often includes activities that actually are most likely to influence public policy or enhance the presence of historians in public culture. The AHA has decided that it's time to map a broader terrain of scholarship with more flexible boundaries. We've taken a hint from the Smithsonian Institution, which was founded for the quote, and I quote, increase and diffusion of knowledge. I want to emphasize that this is not just publicly engaged scholarship. It includes an infinite variety of modes of dissemination of our work. Our recommendations to departments, the recommendation to our departments is to consider the possibility of any work that can be peer reviewed, whether in the traditional way or post hoc. Expert witness testimony, exhibitions, textbooks, databases, op-eds, blogs, all of this can be scholarly or not scholarly. Quick caveat, and then I'll finish. We are not saying that everybody has to do this. We are not saying all historians have to do publicly engaged scholarship. There are many ways of being a historian. We also are not telling our colleagues or our students that they have to do more. We are not saying you've got to do traditional stuff and this too. We are trying to give permission to our departments to think more broadly about what their faculty can do and ought to do, and allow people to do what they do best as long as it is legitimate scholarship. I think we're done.
Well, thanks, colleagues. You certainly have given me a lot to think about, and I know the folks who are listening. I thought maybe we'd just do a couple quick questions and then turn it to the group. I think I told you I'd use the questions I sent, but I'm going to change it a little. In listening to you, I was really curious about this question. All of you are doing really important work and around which you have gotten some traction. But all of you have probably not done all the work you yet hope to do. So I'm curious, at this point, as you think about either scalability or sustainability or transferability, how is your project situated to accelerate change? Can it accelerate change? Can it deepen change? Can it broaden change? How might that work, and how are you thinking about that? And Mike, if you don't mind, I'll start with you.
Thanks. Yeah, I even raised my hand because I thought I could jump in on this. So, so one thing that I think is really a big challenge is moving beyond just a single academic department. I mean, so what we've done at the University of Maryland, I think, is really, actually, it embodies a lot of the things that James mentioned, and this, what I call the principle of impact as access, thinking about access in a very broad way. Who has access to our scholarship? Who has access to become a scholar? How do we really promote our work in a way that reaches the broadest possible audience? But this all works well, right, in the confines of a single department. Portability, or, if people are adopting this and really buy into it, does this limit their ability to transfer it to another institution? And, and really to think about change, you really have to think about it in terms of systems, right? And it's not just, I think it's within a place like the University of Maryland, College Park, we're very decentralized. The provosts, they look to us to define what the academic criteria are for promotion and tenure, for annual review. And that autonomy has been great. But that says nothing about the discipline within, right? And so there's this lateral level at which now the goal is to work with other departments of psychology across the country to sort of embrace a common set of values that, and say, look, here are the things that we value. Here are the things that we think should count. And to James' point, not present these as mandates, but to legitimate them as ways in which we can evaluate scholarship. And so we've done that through, at least locally, promoting the use of transparent openness as criteria essentially for quality. Instead of thinking about quality as where you publish, it's how are you making your material maximally accessible? So let's redefine quality. And then the question is, can this be rolled out at a larger scale? And so I know one of the other questions is what are the challenges, and then potential roadblocks to doing this. I think we're at a time where people are very open to change because they recognize the problems. But at the same time, it's the who's going to go first mentality, which we have to get past. And I've been fortunate now. I have a handful of departments I've been able to work with around the country who are all interested in change. And right now, I think the key is finding and building that coalition of the willing to say, hey, we're going to do this because we know it's the right thing to do. And so I think there's real promise in there. We've been rolling out some other sort of workshop type things to sort of move this project forward. And I'll stop there.
Michael, is it primarily the work you're doing with reference to other psychology departments?
Yeah, it's primarily the interface with other psychology departments, and getting stuff happening here at the University of Maryland has been much more challenging than I anticipated. We haven't been able to get the sort of strong signals that I was really hoping for, in part because I think a lot of our focus has been on not just the DEI part and community engaged work, which is widely embraced, but also the transparency and openness part. We're in the year of the open science, and some of the sciences have really suffered in regard to our ability to reproduce results, and so the trustworthiness of academic institutions is sort of dependent on our ability to produce trustworthy science. Right now, that's not incentivized, right? So, okay.
Lauren, let's go with you next, then Jim, and then Janet.
Great, thanks. Just very briefly, first of all of these topic and discussions have been fantastic, and I wish we had more time. But there's one that I thought might be helpful just to take a slightly different perspective. And that is regarding the question of departments and disciplines versus the university ecosystem as a whole. And I had the experience of being the provost at the University of British Columbia, where one of the things I really deeply believed in was trying to find ways to understand people who were in core positions in departments unlike my own, which happened to be in science. And I found it very difficult, but not impossible. It just doesn't come naturally. It takes more work to find common ground between in interdisciplinary work, as we all know. Where is that common ground? It's in higher principles of scholarship that actually are very similar in multiple disciplines. And why am I mentioning that? Because we all know it. I'm mentioning it in the specific context of collaboration with non-academics, which, at least in the case of high bar research, is an essential prerequisite. And the collaboration doesn't mean that we're out there in the world interacting with non-academics, trying to understand their problems so we can solve them for them. That's, in my opinion, a very backward way of thinking about how we can interact, because those people in those locations in the world are experts on the problems that need to be solved. And perhaps more importantly, they're experts at life and experts in problem solving. They're leaders for a reason. And they have incredible ability to contribute to the research enterprise as long as they have an opportunity to do so in a mutually respectful way. So that's why I think it's so important to try to transcend individual areas of scholarship and think about the bigger picture. And I'll just add to that and then stop by saying that there's a long history of interactions involving really brilliant people from outside a field, interacting with people inside a field, asking questions that might not otherwise be asked, and causing or catalyzing incredible breakthroughs. And that's why I feel just so optimistic about everything we've heard today. Every single aspect of the presentations today, I believe, strengthens that perspective. And I find it very exciting. So thanks. I've probably taken too long to say that. But.
Jim, you want to hop in and then
Sure.
Janet right after?
Sure. And I'd like to agree with Lauren there in terms of thinking about these larger principles that relate to the college or university's role in public life. And that in the end, that it's the mission of the university that matters. And I want to emphasize, by the way, that not every college and university has the same mission either.
Mhm.
And that one reason to try to think about different directions from which change comes, top down, bottom up, sideways in, is that different situations exist in different institutions. There are some institutions which in fact are very top down by their nature. And I won't go into which types, but that can be very hierarchical for cultural and institutional and historical reasons. And there are other institutions which, higher ed institutions, which are very much bottom up because of their historical culture. So I want to emphasize that this is exactly the point. We need to think about not versus, but rather the different ways in which these directions can work together. This problem of portability that Michael mentioned, I think that's one of the virtues of having scholarly associations central to this process. Because if a chemist is in one university and wants to move to another university, and the American Chemical Society has said these are reasonable qualifications for being a full professor, then that kind of movement across institutions becomes more possible. So again, it's a matrix. It's internal as well as across institutions. I also think it's important. One of the reasons why, and I'm going to go back, I have to obviously defend disciplines here, but one of the reasons why it's important to think about this on a disciplinary level is that differences across disciplines can matter when it comes to definitions of scholarship, when it comes to criteria of publication. The quickest and easiest answer, which would be controversial, and we'd be able to spend the next 7 days talking about it, is open access. We in the humanities have very different notions about the difference between free and open, what open access means. There's cultural differences, there's funding differences, and it's important to recognize, therefore, that the standards for publication that relate to, quote, open science are going to be very different in the humanities. We share our data all the time. That's not an issue. Anyway, so there are different issues by disciplines that I think matter if we're going to try to broaden our definition of scholarship without getting into constant tiny little details.
Janet, hop in.
Well, I agree with all of my colleagues, and I want to say a little bit about the process at UMBC, because we are doing it at a university level, but that requires each individual department to buy in. And so this has really been driven by the faculty. And we have a group of faculty who were a subcommittee of our faculty senate that went around to every department and had a conversation at faculty meetings and talked about it and got feedback and took that feedback and incorporated it in. So it was not a fast process. This was multiple years of having these conversations. And it's something that is voluntary. No one's saying that everyone has to be doing community engaged research. Not everyone has to be incorporating DEIA principles into their research. But by showing the success stories and showing the impact of the work that the people who are doing it are having, I think that helps others to see the benefits of doing it. And since we're talking about graduate education, our students that come in, many of them are really excited about making sure that their research that they're doing is going to have real impact, that people can understand. That if you're talking to your family, they say, what is it that you're working on? That people can understand it. And so I think that the students are also helping, they see this happening and they're excited about it, and they're helping to propel the motion forward, and I think will help define the future. The acceptance of professional societies is really important. For those in the STEM disciplines, organizations like the National Science Foundation are really pushing that by having initiatives where you can get funding, and we know that funding makes a difference. The National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine are also pushing these things, and that has a very big impact on faculty in those fields if the scholars, those members of the academy, are saying that this is something good. So I think it takes all fronts, as my colleagues have been saying. But I think the momentum is forward, and it's what people see as a priority to do.
Thanks, Janet. So I think rather than ask a second question, I'm going to make two quick observations and then turn to, I think there was a question in the box, and I'll see if I can retrieve it. But the two observations go like this. My colleague Earl Lewis, who was the president of Mellon Foundation for many years, said he had a standing offer to his PIs. He said, bring me a large, transformative, big project that will totally redo the structure of graduate education in the humanities at your university, and I'll fund it. And he said he never could get any university to take the first dollar. And I think this is a reflection on some of the things we've been talking about. It's hard to step out first and alone. And so thinking about how we strategize to think about reducing the risk on any one person is something to think about. The other observation I would make, and probably I've shared this with a couple of you, the most troubling thing I ever heard with a group of first-gen racially and ethnically diverse graduate students that I had over to my office for lunch was not what I expected, that there were feelings of not fitting in and of imposter syndrome, of feeling, sort of microaggressions. What they said was the most frustrating thing about their experience was that there was absolutely no room for them to take intellectual risks, that they thought when they came to the university, they would be able to follow curiosity and their minds and their ideas. And they found instead that they were expected to execute on the work of a mentor and the concepts. So I think in here someplace is a pathway to both helping us think about how we structure next steps, but also to try to really understand what it signals for the way we mentor students to create opportunities for intellectual risk, but bounded in some way so that they can take risks, but that doesn't mean the end of their careers. So just something else to think about. And I'm going to turn to the question and answer, but the question that was there has disappeared.
That's my fault because I posted an answer. My apologies.
Okay, do you want to?
Yeah, basically the question was about whether we should require graduate students as part of their dissertation to talk about the public impact of their work. I think that's a fair summary of the question.
Anybody else have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I can tell you what my answer was that when I was teaching graduate students, I always asked at the level of the proposal, not even at the defense, who cares? Why is this going to matter to anybody other than yourself and your 7 best friends and the 6 other people in your little area of specialization? I do not think that every dissertation has to have a public impact or has to be significant to public culture. A dissertation can be a breakthrough in a discipline, even in a subdiscipline, and it's still important. I do think that obviously every dissertation, every student should be able to say, this is why this matters.
Yeah, Lauren?
I agree. And I'd just like to add maybe a reverse way of looking at the same question, which is, should we be encouraging everyone, and of course, including graduate students, to think about the impact of the public involvement on their research? It's a two-way street, not a one-way street. And I think that's a very provocative question that could have a lot of impact.
Interesting. Janet?
For people who want to see what the question is, if you go in the Q&A and click on the tab answered, you can see the question again. But what I wanted to say is that I think the 3-minute thesis competition is something that gets at this, because one of the things that the students are supposed to talk about is why should someone care, right? So, you know, what is your research? What's your contribution? Why should we care? And well, it doesn't have to have, you know, a major impact that's changing the world. I think that those are 3 questions that students should be able to answer. And so the more we get students thinking about that in, you know, 3-minute thesis and how you talk about your work, you know, maybe including something like that in your dissertation. And for those, again, in the STEM disciplines, if you're going to submit a grant to NSF, you're going to have to answer broader impacts. And so it actually is good preparation for what you're going to be doing. If you don't go into academia and you're in the workplace, you're going to have to answer, what is the impact of my work on the, you know, the bottom line of the company or of the nonprofit that you're doing. So I actually like the idea.
Michael.
Yeah, I'll just say that, you know, I think there's a tendency for to put a lot of weight on the impact of work, but in reality, you know, a lot of work is incremental, and it's okay for it to be incremental. And I think we send the wrong message when we tell students or young faculty that, you know, every piece of scholarship has to be groundbreaking. It has to be changing the world. Because quite frankly, 99.9% of the work we do either will never have an impact, or the impact that we'll have will come years, decades into the future. And so, you know, there's this fine line between sort of overstating and, you know, at least, but I do agree, right, with James's point that you should have a reason for it, right? You should be able to justify your existence as a scientist for whatever perspective that is. And justifying the work in the same way.
Yeah. And I think this may be a really healthy point to end with the recognition that changing metrics and reward and recognition systems for scholarship do not replace the commitment and recognition that good science will continue and always be basic science in research that is incremental. The challenge is simply to create the space in a portfolio of projects for new voices, new modes, and maybe high risk, high reward research. Colleagues, thank you so much for joining us today. Those of you on Zoom and those of you with us as panelists, let's treat this as the beginning of a longer conversation where we strategize to figure out what are the key things that coalitions of the willing can accomplish, and how can we amplify one another's not just talk, but their actual work and implementation. It's really important work and smart people. And I thank you very much and wish everybody a good move toward the end of the fall semester. Thank you.
Thank you.
And if you can join us in Denver at the summer workshop, we're going to be talking more about it there. So see you soon.